All right. So we have some business to take care of. For the, I'll show off to Professor Peterson. This was the first week. This is a screen grab. I don't know if you've seen Chris Parsons' Birth of Boston DH project. It's pretty cool, where he's mapping the mapping sort of the first plottings and neighborhoods within the city of Boston. That's a screen grab from that. And then this is the one that's up for grabs right now. This was from Marty Blatt and Chris. Is it focusing? Marty Blatt and Christine DeLucia's class. And I have William Apis on the back.
Right.
I took that picture of Deer Island. I went to Castle Island with my kids and took it. Wow. It's a little fuzzy. But today we have, and I've gone two-tone. There's real coffee in it. Two-tone. Okay.
Very nice.
So we've got on one side the Massachusetts pine. Oh, it's got a focus here. Pine tree shilling, and on the back the Massachusetts oak tree shilling.
All right.
So focusing very well. But that's what's up for grabs today. And like I said, each one is getting better. By the last class, they're going to be like gold leafed with a satellite dish coming out of them. You know, so it's really, really nice. But we have this to take care of. So last week, the question was, in what year did Boston formally repeal the law on its books from King Philip's War that said you could not have there could be no unaccompanied Indian within the town limits? And the correct answers were from Emma Richards, Maggie Fitzpatrick again, Eric Beshy, Daniel Lee, and Michaela Moskowitz. Are you guys all here?
Here.
Hi.
Here. Okay, so what year was it?
2005.
2005. Very good. There were a lot of 2004s and 2003s because there was a New York Times article about it. I'm sure that's what people read. That was from November 2004, saying that the city council had voted to begin to repeal, had voted to put the question up to repeal in 2003, and that they were going to do it at the next city council meeting. But they actually only passed it in 2005. And so Christine DeLucia has that in her book. She says 2005. So there were a lot of 2003s, 2004s, and 2005s. And I have to give kudos to Michaela because she actually read both and emailed me about it and said, you know, I read 2003, I read 2004, and in Professor DeLucia's book, she says 2005. So she actually picked that up. And the answer is 2005. Okay, so we're going to do a number between 1 and 100. I have the number on my phone, predetermined. Emma, what's your number?
It's going to be 25.
25. Maggie, what's your number?
I'll go 45.
45. Eric, what's your number?
50.
50. Low numbers. All right, Daniel, what's your number?
52.
52. Michaela, what's your number?
73.
73. Okay, and the number is, I went with my daughter's hockey number. Do you see that? It's not 12, it's 21. I had her model the jersey. I'll do my son's next week, so nobody break in my house or actually, if you want to come to his game on the weekend to find his jersey number, I will allow that. Okay, so that's Emma. Emma, 25.
Yay, thank you.
You are the owner. You are the owner of this mug, not the one I'm drinking from. I have a different one for you. And email me about picking it up at Renaissance Park. And unlike Noah, who never is drinking it during class, I obviously expect you to be drinking from it. Okay, so we are very, 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 very fortunate to have Professor Mark Peterson with us today. He is Edmund S. Morgan Professor of History at Yale University, and is really one of the leading experts on Puritan New England and colonial America. His first book was called The Price of Redemption, The Spiritual Economy of Puritan New England. And this book, for those of you who haven't seen it in person, gorgeous and big. As I was telling Professor Peterson yesterday, I actually read it in situ on Cape Cod. I guess Boston is also in situ, but I felt that it felt more, Boston doesn't feel very colonial anymore, whereas Cape Cod still does a little bit. And as I told you guys at the beginning of the class, Professor Peterson, they have access to all of these through the library as ebooks. But I said, if you were looking to buy books, buy all the books, buy the books that are interesting to you. But if you're looking for a recommendation to buy one book on Boston, this is the one that I would recommend. It's such a pleasure to read, and I learned so much from it. So Professor Peterson's going to give us, let me give you some capabilities here, should you need them. So Professor Peterson is going to give us a little bit of an introduction to his to the book and to chapter 1, and then we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask him a few questions, and as always, you guys can ask questions in the chat, and I will monitor it. And if it's on point or an interruption is necessary, I will do so, and otherwise I may shelve it for an opportune moment. All right.
All right, am I on?
You are.
Good. All right, well, thank you very much, Simon, for inviting me. It is a treat to be here at your very early class time. We don't start so early down here in New Haven, where the sun
That's why Boston became the more important city,
Exactly, the sun comes up a lot later here. So yes, I'm happy to be here. What I'll do is talk a little bit about why this book, about why I wrote this thing, as a way to set up a discussion of the chapter that you read, which I understand is chapter 1, and perhaps for some of you chapter 2, but we'll worry about that later. So Boston is a city that is steeped in mythology. If you have walked the Freedom Trail, you may have a sense of what I'm talking about here. And one of the undying myths about this city is that its founders imagined that it would be a city upon a hill. If I were speaking to you in person, I would ask how many of you have heard that phrase with respect to Boston. You can nod vigorously, yes, raise your hand.
I hope they
wiggle your laptop.
They had to read Winthrop's sermon, so I hope they've all seen it.
Okay, but if you've read, did they read the whole thing, Simon? Or
yes.
Okay, because the whole thing is fairly long. And
I'm punitive.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to be. And if you read that, you notice that phrase only appears at the very end of it in the last chapter. Not the last chapter, the last paragraph. I don't know how well Simon set all of this up, but one of the striking things about that is that, yes, it's always called a sermon, but it's not at all clear that that's really what it was, in part because the person who is supposed to have written it, John Winthrop, was not a clergyman. He was not a minister. He was a lawyer. And the magistrate who founded one of the founders of the town. Another problematic thing about that document is that the only surviving copy of it is not in John Winthrop's handwriting. It is in somebody else's handwriting. We don't know whose. The other commonly claimed thing for that document is that John Winthrop is supposed to have read this or spoken it as a sermon on shipboard while the migrants were crossing the Atlantic from England to come to Massachusetts. Well, that's a real problem too, partly because the migrants were coming in 11 ships. So the point of one person reading a sermon to everybody when everybody is spread across 11 different ships across miles and miles of ocean is kind of lost. There was no Zoom, for instance, at the time for them to use. So actually, we don't know that, and in fact, it's kind of doubtful that this was a sermon and that it was ever spoken aloud to anybody, anywhere. And if it was, it would have been in England before they left to the other directors of the company, not to all of the migrants. And the last curious thing about that sermon is that it utterly disappeared. There is no reference to it anywhere in colonial New England by any of its historians, by Winthrop himself, by anyone involved in the founding of the city. It was only discovered in a trunk of papers that belonged to a distant descendant of John Winthrop in New York City in the 1820s, and it wasn't published until the 1830s. And even when it was published then, no historians really used it until around 1952. It's a little bit like the repeal of the unaccompanied Indian law. In 1952, an essay by a historian or a scholar at Harvard named Perry Miller used this phrase and brought it to the public attention. And unfortunately, this historian made up stuff about it. That is, he invented the shipboard speaking idea. He called it a sermon. And it was only at that point that people started using that city upon a hill phrase to talk about Boston or the founding of Massachusetts. But it was so appealing then that it started to be picked up by politicians and journalists and the like. So John Kennedy used it in a sort of farewell speech he gave to the Massachusetts legislature before he became president. And then Ronald Reagan used it in a kind of farewell speech that he gave as he was finishing up his term as president of the United States. And he too sort of embellished it by adding the word shining, that he said shining city on a hill. And what he imagined was that this was some sort of visionary statement about how wonderful America was going to be someday. And it made you think as if, the early colonists of Massachusetts were, walking around the streets of Boston, asking each other, so how's the whole city on a hill thing going today? Are we up on a hill enough? And, none of that's true. It's this most familiar phrase associated with the founding of Boston and the early history of Massachusetts, and it's frankly all made up. There's not a shred of evidence that anybody in colonial Boston, revolutionary Boston, etc., ever used that phrase or thought about that. And even if they did, you've read this sermon, right? Or document, text. When Winthrop is using it at the end of this lengthy text, he's using it as a warning. He's saying a city upon a hill is a dangerous, exposed place to be when you can't hide. If you screw up, which we're pretty likely to do, then everybody will see it and people will laugh at us. And so it was not even uttered as a statement of how great and wonderful everything is going to be someday or soon, but rather as a warning against failure. And part of the reason that he's saying this is that almost every English colony up until that point had been a disastrous failure. So this was, for me, a kind of long-winded way of saying what I was trying to do with this book is to tell the true story of Boston, to pull away a lot of the mythic nonsense that has been built around it, and try to approach its history in a fresh way, There's one other kind of mythic nonsense that was really important to me in thinking about that. And that is the way in which the history of the United States, that is this very large, powerful nation that we live in, that came into being in the 1770s and has grown precipitously ever since then. The history of that thing, the country that we live in, tends to cast a big shadow over everything that happened before it. In particular, leading historians to look at all of the early history as somehow just preparatory, as people sort of getting ready for the United States to come along, as if Paul Revere was just sitting around looking at his watch, waiting for the moment that he could get on his damn horse and go tell people that the British are coming. And so a lot of the sort of mythic structure around Boston and as its history is a product of the way people have told the history of the United States. So that was a big impetus for this book as well, which was to tell the history of Boston for its own sake, as the kind of place it really was, and not trying to anticipate the coming of the United States all the time. And even after the independence of Britain's colonies, including Massachusetts, and the forming of the United States, to not assume that this was necessarily a good thing, that the people of Boston were well suited to the decision of joining the United States the way they did. And I say that word decision quite consciously because it's critical, I think, for historians or people who study history generally to understand that things don't just happen automatically, that people make choices and decisions to do this and not that. And that is how history works, how it's formed. And we have a tendency to kind of assume a sort of automatic quality to things, that because it happened, it had to happen that way. So a big purpose of this book too is to restore this contingency, the sense that at every moment people were faced with decisions and problems and questions of what to do now and what to do next, and that good history is focused on understanding how and why those decisions were made the way they were. So that's kind of a setup of the book as a whole. The chapter that we'll at least start with today is the first chapter, and it's zeroing in on that question of, okay, let's look at the contingency. How was Boston founded? What were the challenges that this place faced from the very beginning, and what kinds of choices did they make in order to solve the problems? And so it includes things like developing a sustainable economy. They didn't want to die. They didn't want to fail the way many colonies had. It involved dealing with all the different peoples around them, the range of different Indian groups who lived in New England, but also other nearby colonies of the Dutch, of the French, of other English groups that were not part of their colonizing project and they didn't necessarily like. And also the question of why it is that Boston in the end becomes the most powerful center of the religious movement, the Puritan movement that they were a part of, given the fact that there were a bunch of other places that Puritans were trying to colonize at the time too. There was no guarantee that Boston would necessarily become the most important Puritan colony. So those are all the questions that are at the heart of this first chapter in order to get the story going and help people understand how Boston even became Boston from the beginning. How's that, Simon? Does that set us up?
That's excuse me. That's absolutely perfect. And I would actually roll with the last point and ask you if you could explain maybe this term Puritan Atlantic and a little bit about what the reasons were why Boston was the sort of last Puritan colony standing, or I mean, it didn't go disappear, but by how it defaulted to being the most important center of this Puritan Atlantic.
Yeah. So refresh my memory. Have you talked much about Puritanism or the Puritan movement in earlier classes?
Not that much. No, we did. So we did. Christopher Parsons did a sort of introduction, and we have discussion sections. So we talked a little bit about, well, at least in my discussion sections, there are a few of us, but about Protestantism and the idea of predestination that infuses some of these texts, and but really haven't gotten and the point that not everybody was Puritan. Also, this was one of Professor Parsons' point that not everybody was Puritan, and that there were actually loyal Church of England types already here when Winthrop showed up. But that's the extent of it. So we definitely could use a refresher.
Okay, well, I'll say a few words about that as a way into this. So the Puritan movement in England, it was part of the larger European-wide Protestant Reformation, but it was basically both a religious and a political movement. That is, the people who were committed to it, and that includes most of the founders of Massachusetts, were disappointed, dissatisfied with the official structure of the state church in England. And it's important to remember that every European society, every country at the time, had an official state church, which the expectation was all of the people who lived in that country were born into that, and that would be their religion. And Europe was deeply divided over this, because there were the countries that remained loyal to the Roman Catholic Church and to the Pope in Rome. And then there were the Protestant countries who were critics of the Roman Catholic Church and broke away from it and had their own form of Christianity as their state religion. And so part of Germany and Sweden and the Netherlands and then also England and Scotland were Protestant countries. But from the Puritan point of view, the English Church's Reformation was kind of a compromise, kind of halfway between the older Roman Catholicism and the Protestant alternatives. And this was upsetting to them, and for both religious and political reasons. And for now, I want to focus on the political side of it. They believed that the organizing structure of either the Roman Catholic Church or the Church of England was wrong, that it was very top-down, very hierarchical, that the king was the head of the church. The king appointed the archbishop, who oversaw the appointment of the bishops, and the whole sort of vertical structure of that church organization. And what's more, there had been some hope among Puritan reformers that they could push back against it, and that they could get the king to modify those positions. And the English monarchs in the 1600s, first James I and then his son Charles, were just totally opposed to any kind of compromise on this. And so in effect, what the Puritan movement became was a kind of underground resistant political movement. And so they would organize small groups of people, even within a formal church, to worship together in private, and to sort of scheme for ideas about how they could undermine the formal church government, how they could evade its persecuting tendencies. And the thing is, there were all sorts of people who were part of this Puritan movement, including some of the greatest aristocrats, the great nobles of England, dukes and earls and counts and the like. And so some of them, you might think of them today as the equivalent of, senators of the United States, really major, powerful figures, thought that one possible way that they could promote this movement and yet escape the persecuting qualities of the English government was to use their power to form colonies in other places. And so one of these aristocratic groups decided that they would set up a colony in the middle of the Caribbean, in this little island called Providence Island off the coast of Central America. And part of the idea was that as powerful political leaders who could, command loyal military followers, that they would plant themselves in the Caribbean because that was Spanish territory, right? Spain was the controlling colonial power over Central and South America. And they saw Spain as England's great enemy. Spain was the great Catholic power. They wanted England to be the great Protestant power. So they thought if they put a Puritan colony way down in the Caribbean, that they would be in charge of, they would bring the colonists, that they could use it as a base to launch attacks against the Spanish islands like Hispaniola or Cuba or the coast of Central America. And in fact, that was their big plan, that they would set up this island colony, and then before long they would be strong enough that they could create a Puritan British colony on the coast of Central America. And because these guys were great aristocrats, they had no desire to make this a kind of self-governing, democratic, egalitarian society. You know, this was, you know, the Earl of Lincoln. These were people who were used to being great rulers. So even though they were Puritans, this was not their vision of what a colony would be. And so that colony is formed at almost exactly the same time as Boston and Massachusetts. Now, by contrast, the people who found Boston are sort of much more middling kinds of people. Like John Winthrop, for instance, was not a great aristocrat. He was a lawyer. His father and his grandfather before him had been merchants involved in the cloth business. And so they were prosperous people, and his grandfather had bought this small estate out in the countryside with the profits he had made as a cloth merchant. But they were not titled aristocrats. They were not members of the House of Lords. And their associates were other people of similar status, other merchants. As a lawyer, Winthrop worked in London a lot and met a lot of other Puritans there. But other people involved in this were farmers or, you know, small-scale artisans, people who worked with their hands, you know, silversmiths or saddle makers, or, you know, a whole array of traditional trades. And so this group of much more sort of average middling Puritans didn't have the kind of power or access to it that, say, these great earls who founded the Providence Island colony did. Instead, they pooled their money. And they managed, through a few contacts with the aristocracy, to get the king to grant them a charter for this colony in Massachusetts. And a charter was like a kind of corporate founding document. There were chartered cities at the time. The universities in England had charters that allowed them to govern themselves. Yeah.
Sorry, I punished them by making them read that as well.
The Massachusetts Charter. Oh my God. So you know all about the 1/5 of all the gold and silver goes to the king, that stuff, right? Yeah.
I mean, it was in there, and they were meant to read it. I mean, yeah. I would forgive them from skimming through a few parts, but
so would I.
I wanted them to contrast. I wanted them to contrast some of the sentiments in Winthrop's speech and some of the sentiments in the charter.
Yeah, so. Well, the charter is about as sentimental as any legal document, right? It's kind of a contract, and so they get that, and they use charters to set up trading companies then too. That was the other big use for them, and they were especially effective as a way to pool money, right? So that you're doing a big risky thing like starting an overseas colony, and you don't want, you know, one person you try to take all of the risk of that. So instead you put in dozens of investors, and everyone puts in a smallish amount so that you have enough money to do it. But if the thing turns out to be a disaster, which most early colonies did, then any individual's losses is pretty limited, right? And so that's how they go about it, unlike the aristocrats who found the Providence Islands Company. And therefore, the people who go there tend to be the same sorts of folks, not England's poorest people, but not the great aristocrats either. In fact, there's only one or two people with a formal title, you know, Sir, et cetera, who end up going to Massachusetts at all, and they don't stay. And the reason is that Winthrop and the others like him set up, for the time, an extraordinarily egalitarian colony. And that's kind of what Winthrop is talking about in that model of Christian charity document, that everyone is in this together and you're responsible for your neighbor. And if you have more and they have less, it's your duty to lend them what they need to get along, right? It's a model of Christian charity that is of how all the members of community need each other and will rely on each other to move forward. And so the governments that they set up in Massachusetts are pretty extraordinarily representative and egalitarian for the time. And by that I mean government in both the state and the church. So the churches of Massachusetts are self-selecting, right? People join because they want to, and they get to choose their own minister. It's not appointed for them by the king or by anyone on high. They say, this is the person that we want, right? And so the churches have this self-governing quality, and the civil society is set up the same way. The charter allows all of the investors in the company to choose who's going to govern it. They get to elect the governor and a set of other members of a council or a kind of group of assistants to the governor. And right away, when they get to Massachusetts, Winthrop and the other members of the council decide that, look, we should just let every male head of household who has come over here have a vote, right? Even if they didn't invest, their cash in the company, the fact that they've sold off their home, their businesses, and put everything they have into coming to Massachusetts and leaving England behind means everyone should really have a voice in this enterprise. And so in both the church and the state, and the level of the towns too. And so right away, they're bringing enough people across the ocean, really large numbers for those times. About 20,000 people come to Massachusetts in that first decade of migration. They start spreading out. They're not all concentrated in one spot, but they're starting all of the different little towns, not just Boston, but Roxbury and Dorchester and Lynn and Cambridge and Concord and Watertown, etc. And so as they're spreading out, they decide, if we're going to actually be able to hear from people who don't live right next door, they can send representatives to Boston and there'll be a kind of assembly or a legislature for the colony as a whole. And so and the towns themselves are allowed to make all of their own internal decisions, that they will elect their own selectmen and govern themselves that way as well. So compared to English government at the time, compared to this aristocratic Puritan colony down in the Caribbean, Massachusetts is a different model, right? And there was no guarantee that this was necessarily going to work. And in fact, if you had been a sort of wagering person in 1629 and looked at these two colonies, a lot of people would have bet on the Providence Island one because of the great wealth and the power of the people who were setting it up compared to these relative nobodies who were starting Massachusetts. And so when I talk, this is like the most long-winded answer in history. When I talk about the Puritan,
not at all. It's very helpful.
What I mean is that at this time, there were lots of members of the Puritan movement in England whose general thought was, we got to get out of here, right? That things are looking very bad for Puritans here. And so they go a lot of different places. A whole bunch of them go to the Netherlands, which is one of the most tolerant religious societies in Europe at the time. They go to try other English colonies. There are a lot of Puritans who go to Bermuda in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There are some who go to Virginia, which is already established as a colony, long before Massachusetts comes into being. And so all of these were places where parts of this Puritan religious and political movement are looking, thinking maybe this is where our future would be. And so Massachusetts and Boston in particular become the center of that, not because it was the only one or because it had to be, but because of the politics and the economics of the way things then go in this wider Atlantic world.
That's great.
I'm
So
going to stop and take a breath and a sip.
no, go right ahead. And you know what? I'll actually, there's a question in the chat, so I'll ask that to you before my next question, which is, how many of the migrants bound for Boston came directly from England, rather than from the Netherlands?
The great majority. You may be thinking about the Plymouth Colony story, in which these are the so-called pilgrims, right, of the Mayflower and the first Thanksgiving and making little turkeys out of your hand and all that kind of stuff, right? That was, the Plymouth Colony was this group of really ultra radical Puritans. They were so radical in their commitment to their religion that they simply decided that the King of England, James I, was not a true king, really, and they owed him no allegiance because his church structure was false and wrong. And therefore they were essentially traitors, or are the most radical dissenters against the government. And that's why they left in about 1607 and went to the Netherlands, because they were in real danger of their lives, right? They could be arrested and tried and even sentenced to death for being, they call them separatists, right? For denouncing the value of the king's church. And the Massachusetts Puritans were not as radical as that. They continued to hope for reform, but they weren't going to say that the king is just, the Antichrist and we got to get out of here. So, the Plymouth colonists did, about half of them come from the Netherlands, where they had been living for about 12 years before they moved. But the Massachusetts, and that was a very tiny group, right? The whole Plymouth venture was only about 100 colonists on the Mayflower, and within about 6 months, half of those were dead from starvation and disease in Plymouth. If you've ever been to Plymouth, you'll understand why that's the case. And by comparison, Massachusetts brought, something like 20,000 people over, 2,000 or so a year for 10 years. And almost all of them came directly from England. There were a few, mostly clergymen who had been, under warrants for their arrest, who had escaped England and gone to the Netherlands to stay out of trouble, who joined the Massachusetts thing, but most of them come straight from England.
But that's a great question, and it raises one of the bigger points that Professor Peterson makes throughout the course of the book, which is about the expansion of Boston within Massachusetts and New England. And because, of course, Plymouth and Massachusetts were separate colonies, but ultimately, as we know now, Cape Cod and Plymouth and that area, the southern coastal Massachusetts, is part of Massachusetts, and that's part of the story of Boston's expansion as a sort of, almost as a city-state, as Professor Peterson calls it, or as a quasi-empire even. It expands and absorbs that territory. But that's also part of the story, right? Because this was Plymouth at the end of the day was a node in the Puritan Atlantic, right?
Right.
But one that fails, right?
No, the Plymouth does.
Yeah.
Well, or sort of has only extremely limited success.
Right. It becomes insignificant compared to Boston, I guess.
Exactly, maybe. Right. The way almost everything does.
Right.
Eventually.
Right.
I'm looking for a slide that I used recently that I can help to illustrate that with. And here it is. I will be sharing my screen in a second, if that's okay.
You have full capabilities.
Okay. I just have to get to the right. image. Okay, good. This is how you can tell that I'm old. Okay, is that working?
Yeah,
Okay.
beautiful.
Play from current slide. Okay, so this helps explain what I'm talking about here, right? Because the charter that Massachusetts got and that any colony got was the basis for their claim to own land or to have the ability to control land. Now, of course, all of this land was occupied by and belonged to Native Americans. So from the get-go, there was this sort of fictional idea that the king, that the English government could just give this away to whoever they wanted to, and yet that was the idea that they operated under. But one of the things that I emphasize in the book is that not all of these charter grants were the same, certainly not the same in size. So the one that Massachusetts got was this very narrow, it's in pink here, strip of land. Its southern boundary was defined as 3 miles south of the Charles River, where the Charles meets Massachusetts Bay, and that it went up to 3 miles north of the Merrimack River, where its mouth met the Atlantic Ocean. And this is, as most of you are probably New Englanders know, or you're living in Boston now, this isn't very far. It's only about 40 miles from north to south. Now, the western boundary of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was technically the Pacific Ocean, or as it said in the charter, the South Sea. And that was fine in part because no English person at the time had the slightest idea how far it was from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in fact, there's good evidence for a very long time that the English thought it wasn't very far at all. So that's why this sort of fuzziness on the western edge of Massachusetts, because no one really had any idea how far west it was going to go. And even if they knew it went 3,000 miles west, they couldn't get there anyway. It wouldn't have mattered any. So the problem that Massachusetts faces, well, you can see from right to the south of it, the Plymouth Colony, its charter wasn't as good a legal document, but the patent that it had, or that it claimed, was about as big as that of Massachusetts. But Plymouth only manages to bring a couple of hundred people over in its first decade, and then that's kind of about it. Interest in moving to Plymouth kind of dries up, whereas its neighbor of similar size just to the north brings 20,000 people. And they all are coming in family units. Many of them have, husbands, wives, children, etc. And they very rapidly grow through just natural population increase. So within about 25 years, those 20,000 people are now 50,000 people. By the end of the century, they're 100,000. And they're stuck with this tiny little colony with its small charter. To give you a comparison here, let's see if I can. Here is Virginia by comparison. I don't know how well you can all see. Are the screen things blocking the thing on the right, or no? Can you see it?
You can see it.
You can. Okay. On my screen, it's sort of blocked. But Virginia is immense. The boundaries of Virginia's original charter go from way down here by southern North Carolina all the way up towards almost New York, and then it widens to the northwest as well as going straight across. I mean, Virginia, even without the going all the way to the Pacific, which its charter did, even just to the east of the Mississippi, Virginia is bigger than the whole country of France. Whereas Massachusetts is this tiny little 40-mile wide strip. And Virginia, by contrast, it takes 50 years for Virginia to get 20,000 colonists there. And Virginia's death rates were so high early on that the few colonists they have there are barely surviving. So this was the problem that Massachusetts faced, that politically it had claims to only a small amount of land, and yet it had a larger group of migrants than any other 17th century colonial project did. And so what it really had to do was find room for all of them. Since most people in this era were farmers and they had to grow their own food, they had to find agricultural land for them to farm on. And they also had to find essentially occupations so that they could not just keep themselves alive, but also try to replicate the kind of society and culture they had come from before. That is a really important thing to keep in mind, is that their commitment to Puritan religious culture put them at the most advanced edge of the world of technology, resources, culture in the century in which they lived in. That is, to be a Puritan meant this shocking thing of being committed to everyone in your community learning how to read and write, men, women, children, so that you can read the Bible, so that you can be an active member of this educated religious culture. And so it wasn't enough for them just to be able to go to the New World and, keep themselves alive and live in hovels with the most, primitive possible survival. There would have been no point in leaving England in order to have that, from their point of view, sort of regression, right? They wanted to be able to reconstruct what they had left behind. And to be able to do that, they had to produce goods that they could sell, and sell to an overseas market. Because, you have to remember, in this sort of colonizing society, they're going to be dependent on importing so many of the things they need: clothing, any and all imaginable tools, especially things made of iron, steel, copper, etc. They're going to have to import all of their books, paper, printed matter, ink, and just a huge range of things that we take for granted. Glass for windows, anything that makes life reasonably comfortable that takes complex manufacturing processes, they're not going to be able to do just like that. And so they're dependent on the possibility that the ships from England are going to keep coming and bringing them this stuff. And they're going to have the resources to buy them. And this is exactly the reason why many other colonial projects had failed, right? They had failed for their inability to find some kind of commodity or good that they could sell or trade for these things. Or if they found such a thing, to be able to produce that and to take care of their own needs for food and subsistence and that kind of stuff. It was really a very difficult thing that they were trying to accomplish.
Could you say a word about how the occupational structure, occupational backgrounds that you mentioned of the Puritan colonists as being lawyers and artisans and merchants, etc., how that made them particularly well suited to the challenge of lack of not natural resources to eat. I mean, as you point out, they actually could feed themselves, but natural resources to export for those finished products.
Yeah, right. So the colonies that had come before Massachusetts, if they had succeeded by finding something really valuable that they could export, right? And so you're probably familiar with the Spanish colonization of the Caribbean and Mexico and Peru and the like. And for Spain, this was kind of a no-brainer, because what they encounter there are great reserves of silver and gold that the Mexica Empire in Mexico, that the Incas in Peru, etc. have. And so as far as the King of Spain is concerned, all that gold and silver make it obvious. He's going to send ships, people, merchants, etc. there to reap those rewards. Virginia had finally succeeded after some terrible years when experiments in growing tobacco worked out. And tobacco was this hot new commodity in Europe at the time, and it didn't grow in Europe. And so when Virginians were able to produce this in large volume, they suddenly had something that was in high demand in England, and that made a tremendous difference to them. Now, when Massachusetts was founded, there were already some ideas about things that they knew were there that were in demand in Europe. One of them was fish. And this is largely because the Catholic portions of Southern Europe, Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, etc., have a very high demand for fish because on Fridays and on all of the various feast days of the Roman Catholic calendar, people were prohibited from eating meat, right? And so the market for fish was known to be good there. And the banks of New England had tremendous fishing reserves. And the other thing was furs. In fact, in Europe in the 1500s, 1600s, there was a huge fashion for felt hats made from the pelt of beaver. I think I have an image of it. Let me see. Yeah, on the right, on the left is, of course, a very cute beaver. And on the right is an actual 17th century English felt hat that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London today. It may not look so great now, but it's, 400 years old. And so on the left, the beaver were this other great commodity, and the demand for these kinds of felt products, especially hats, had been so high that the indigenous beaver of Europe, of Russia and the far north, had mostly been hunted out. But it was well known that the forests of North America were plentiful in these animals. So both of these were, on one level, strategies that New Englanders thought, well, okay, that's what we'll sell, right? But the problem was this, and this is what Simon was referring to, the actual colonists coming over were not, on the whole, fishermen. And it takes real skill to know how to hunt and trap and skin and prepare the beaver fur, which is what New England Indians had been doing for themselves, for their own clothing and use and the like. But these English, farmers and merchants and artisans didn't have the slightest idea how to do that. And so they could make some money with these, but it wouldn't provide employment and occupation for 20,000 ordinary English people. Neither one of these things would. So they were only sort of limited and temporary ways of dealing with the economy problem of New England. And then secondly, they quickly overhunted the beaver of New England as well. Basically, once this animal that Indians had used very sparingly for their own needs becomes this commodity in high demand in Europe, it encourages the overhunting of them, and therefore they don't reproduce rapidly enough to replace that population. So even today, all of the New England countryside is filled with place names of, this Beaver Creek and that whatever, and there hasn't been a beaver anywhere near these places in hundreds of years, right? We're still living in the aftermath of this great destruction of the 1600s.
Growing up in Canada, this is what I remember from high school Canadian history, that essentially Canadian settlement, or Upper Canada and Lower Canada, was all about the hunt for beavers for the felt hats of Europe.
Yeah, the Hudson's Bay Company, right? That's what we're doing. And that worked to a certain extent in Canada because they weren't trying to find occupation for enormous populations, right? The colonies themselves were very few traders, hunters, that sort of thing. Yeah. So, as Simon was saying, it was easy enough for these colonists to set up farms in their towns. And in fact, a lot of the work had been done for them because the Indians of southern New England were themselves farmers. They grew corn and beans and squash in their fields, and harvested the kinds of things that grew more or less wild in New England, like berries and nuts and all that kind of stuff. And so before the colonists arrived, there had been a series of really horrific epidemics, smallpox, influenza, measles, things like that. And a lot of the Indian population of eastern Massachusetts had drastically shrunk from those and left much of the land that they had formerly lived on and farmed and the like vacant. And so a lot of the early farms of both Plymouth and Massachusetts were simply Indian farms that the English took over and continued farming there as well. So they could grow their own food, and they brought English imports like wheat and barley and things like that, and livestock. You know, there were no large domestic animals in the Americas before Europeans came. So the English bring sheep and cows and pigs and chickens and all that kind of stuff too. So that's not a problem. But the problem is nobody in England would want to buy, let's say meat, pork or beef that had been raised in New England, slaughtered there, packed in salt and shipped overseas in barrels on a non-refrigerated trip of 2 or 3 months. For one thing, the product wouldn't be so nice once it got there. But the other point is that the English themselves could raise pigs and sheep and cows and chickens and the like. And the most fundamental fact of all of the history of global colonization until the invention of steam engines and that sort of thing is that for long distance overseas voyages, the actual shipping cost makes up the highest amount of the cost of any product. Right? In order to ship anything overseas for, these long weeks, months-long ocean voyages, you had to, first of all, have a ship, which is the most expensive technology in the world at the time. And then you have to pay a crew for months and feed them and keep them alive. And so the shipping costs of any good were really high. And therefore, the premium was always on shipping things that themselves were really valuable, right? So this is why it was fine for the Spanish fleets to carry gold and silver, or why something like tobacco or sugar from the West Indian islands were good colonial commodities, because they were things that were produced cheaply in America, for instance, but sold for a high price in London because you couldn't produce them in London. Right, the climate for growing tobacco or sugar were such that there was no hope that you could produce them at home in England, and that's why the price was high enough to make that shipping cost worthwhile. And the problem that Massachusetts had was that, as far as they could tell, other than the beaver and the fish, which wouldn't employ them enough of them to give them a reason to be there, everything else that they could produce had no market whatsoever in England. And so this was the great worry, that they were cutting themselves off from the source of everything they needed in cultural, social terms, from all of the manufactured goods and all of the connection. They were literally afraid that after the migration stopped around 1640, this is the English Civil War part that we can talk about, that once the migration stopped, there would never be any reason for an English merchant ship ever to come to Massachusetts again, because there was nothing much for them to buy there to bring back to England.
That's great.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat about when Massachusetts starts trading cod, and they start to send cod to Spain in this triangular trade where then the Spanish would send wool to England, and then the English would bring the finished goods back to Boston. But the question is that when to what extent did they keep the profits from the cod trade? According to the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right, we know that the king keeps all the silver and the gold, right? So Jacob is asking, according to the deal, do they get to keep all the profits from?
Oh, right. Yeah, I get it. That's a good question. Well, what the king gets to keep is 1/5 of all the gold and silver that's discovered in the soil of Massachusetts, right? So everyone from the time that Cortez conquers Mexico and discovers that the Aztec Empire has fabulous reserves of gold and silver, everyone after that is always thinking, that's going to be me, that I'm going to go and colonize, North Carolina, and there's going to be more gold than you can possibly imagine. It doesn't happen much, right? But written into every charter was this rule that if something like that happens, then the king gets 1/5 of it, right? But this kind of trade, the king doesn't get any portion of, right? So yeah, the profits do go to the merchants who conduct the trade, but you should understand that the margins are really tight here, right? So that the New England merchants do, reasonably well, but they're not making massive fortunes the way the sugar planters of Jamaica or the great tobacco planters of Virginia are, right? So it takes incredibly careful and really risky trading in order to keep this thing going.
And does that play a role in both the relative continued egalitarianism within the colony, as well as ultimately their survival as a merchant-based economy?
Yeah. Let me talk about that a little bit, because it's kind of complicated, but it's sort of extraordinary the way it works. That is, so when we last visited this story, things were looking desperate, right? In around 1639, 1640, this internal civil war breaks out in England, which has a lot to do with Puritanism. It's not the only cause of it, but that internal conflict and the resistance movement that I've been talking about kind of breaks out into the open again. And when it does, then the reason for Puritans to leave England, to sort of get out of Dodge and go to a safer, more promising place, suddenly dries up, because now lots of English Puritans are thinking, oh, the big show is here. We finally have a chance to take over the government, to make the church the way we want it. Let's stick around. And so not only does migration to New England stop, a whole lot of New Englanders actually go back to England at the time, thinking, why am I wasting my time here at the edge of the earth when I could be involved in these really big events back at home? And so when the migration suddenly stops, it had been like a couple of thousand people every year for a decade, and then suddenly nothing, and year after year nothing. Two bad things happen. One is that, it was those ships bringing the migrants that were the same ships that were bringing the goods that the people already there demanded, like books and paper and tools and clothing and all of this kind of stuff. And so first the thought was, wait a minute, what are we going to do now about getting the things we need? But secondly, year after year, those new migrants had been bringing money. They had sold off their homes and their businesses, etc. And when they brought the money with them, they, as brand new arrivals, just needed everything. They needed to be fed. They needed to build houses and all. So they were spending the money they brought with them to pay the people who were already there for food and for labor to help them build houses. I mean, this is really, really difficult stuff to do. And so the money that they brought with them kept the prices up. It meant that, the farmers raising the wheat and the corn and the pigs and the cows got paid in money for feeding, producing more than they needed themselves to feed all of the new migrants. And when that stopped, the money supply dried up as well, because the money that came over was then being paid to the merchants who were bringing the clothing and the tools and all that kind of stuff. And so quite literally, the prices on the commodities that they had been raising, like corn and wheat and meat and all, dropped to zero. That is, they had been producing more farm goods than they needed with the expectation of migrants coming in to buy and consume that stuff. And then that stopped, and they now had more corn and wheat than they could possibly eat. They couldn't give it away. And this was really alarming too. And so it's exactly this moment, and this is just utter coincidence, that the English colony of Barbados, way on the eastern edge of the Caribbean, is converting to a sugar-based economy. They had been kind of scrabbling around for a number of years, not doing very well, when they made contact with these Dutch colonists who had already been raising sugar. And sugar was the most profitable exotic commodity in Europe at the time. Again, because it wasn't produced in Europe, but its popularity was growing very rapidly. So Barbados converts to a sugar economy in the early 1640s. And to do this, they follow the model that the Dutch had been using and that the Dutch had been borrowing from the Portuguese in Brazil, which was to import enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa and to make them work through violence and force intensively on the work of cultivating and processing sugar. And the profits were so high that they were quite literally, within a decade, importing thousands of enslaved Africans. Barbados is this tiny little island. It's extremely well suited to growing sugar on sort of every inch of farmable land there. And so, like that, this little island is completely converted to sugar. It's importing thousands of enslaved workers, and it has to feed them. And it has to clothe them. And it has to have enough wood to make barrels to export the sugar and molasses in. And it needs wood to run the sugar refining mills and to build housing and structures like that. And so suddenly, and it's almost out of nowhere, there is an overseas market for all of this cheap stuff that New Englanders are good at making. Their salt meat and their fish and their corn and their wheat. And literally, New England farmers start spending their winter nights when there's nothing much going on the farm, carving barrel staves. You know, the family will sit around and produce these things that the merchants can now ship to Barbados. And so this is like the big rescue moment of Massachusetts. When Barbados goes to a sugar economy, they finally find a place that will actually want to buy the cheap stuff that they know how to make very well. And so a number of merchants, they're sponsored by the state, they take a chance, they go to the Caribbean and they find that indeed they can sell their stuff and in return get sugar. And the sugar is then something they can bring to England and sell there, and from the profits from that, they can start bringing back the stuff. So in a sense, Massachusetts becomes its own merchant center, right? And the advantage, this goes back to Simon's question about their ability to keep a relatively egalitarian economy. Their advantage then is the integration of the merchants in places like Boston with the farmers and the artisans in the countryside, right? Because the things that the ordinary farmers can grow are exactly the things that the merchants want and want to be able to send out. And this is what makes Massachusetts different from a place like Virginia or a place like the Caribbean islands. Because in those economies that become devoted to a single staple crop of high value, in those places, the people who are lucky enough to own the best land and then invest their money in either slaves or other kinds of bound labor like indentured servitude, they become the ruling class, right? And everyone else who isn't lucky enough to be sort of early in the game, a big landowner with a lot of control over labor, is kind of out of luck. And you get this kind of bifurcated class structure in these staple colonies, and especially the bound labor, whether they're slaves or indentured servitude. They're like way down on the bottom. In case you haven't sort of explored this or whatever, the death rates in places like the West Indian colonies are just so unbelievably high that they're kind of like labor camps, really. I mean, over the course of its first century or so, a place like Barbados probably imported like 200,000 enslaved Africans, and at the end of that, there are only like 50,000 of them left alive. Right? They work people to death in them, and then get another slave. That's how these are structured, and so it creates this horrific. I'm trying to show my hands here. Divide in society between the tiny number of rulers and everybody else. Whereas the Massachusetts system, not only is it sort of self-governing, but it has integrated the overseas merchant business with they need each other, right? And so it means that it has the kind of economy that naturally lends itself towards a certain amount of mutual respect and egalitarianism. Does it mean that there were no rich and no poor people? No, but it means that the gap is much smaller.
What was really interesting in the chapter is you bring up that, again, to talk about decisions, that there was consideration of moving towards a chattel slavery economy, right? And it didn't really go anywhere. There were proposals for it, and we don't know specifically what the rationale was, that was rejected, or that the colony didn't go that route. But do you have specific thoughts? Do you have any thoughts of why they chose to reject that route?
Right. So all of this is happening in the middle of the 1640s. And these merchants from Boston are going down there to the Caribbean and being very successful in trade and bringing back, Spanish silver, and they're bringing the sugar, and they said, this is going to work, right? And so there's correspondence among people who are involved in this. And there was this, so the Winthrops, they're one of the leading families, but there was this other family, the Downings. Emmanuel Downing was John Winthrop's cousin, and is also was a London merchant before he came to America. And he has a son named George Downing, who was one of the first graduates of Harvard College in the 1640s. And George thinks maybe he's going to be a minister, and he gets on one of these merchant ships and goes to Barbados and actually observes what's going on there. And he writes back to John Winthrop's son, his cousin, and says, look, this is amazing. The economy here is booming, and it's all because they're bringing all of these enslaved Africans and doing sugar. We might want to think about something like that for Massachusetts. And the father, Emmanuel Downing, writes a similar letter to John Winthrop saying, we could maybe make this work. In fact, he has this kind of scheme. He says, well, we've already had this one war with Indians, the Pequot War of 1637. And in that, we captured a bunch of male warriors and sent them into the Caribbean slave markets. And Emmanuel Downing says, well, we could do that again. If we had another Indian war, we could get a bunch of captives like that and trade them for African slaves. And the phrase he uses is, and have them do all of our business. What that meant exactly was hard to know. By the way, that George Downing is the man who decides eventually to go back to London because of the English Civil Wars, becomes a big figure in that. And Downing Street, where the Prime Minister's residence is, 10 Downing Street, is named after George Downing. He becomes a land developer in London, and that street is named after this Boston boy. Anyway, well, I could have used that as a trivia.
Yeah, that could have been a trivia.
I blew it. Okay.
No, we have a good one. Don't worry.
Yeah. So next time you teach this.
I am taking a note of that.
Okay. So, and so we don't have responses from either of the Winthrops to these letters. So we don't, have them. But here's what I think happened. The problem of that's not the right word. The puzzle, or the question of whether or not to move towards a slave-based economy was in a sense an investment question. That is, slavery was not the only way to secure a labor force. Another way was a less permanent form of bound labor, like indentured servitude, which is when someone doesn't become a slave for life, but rather for whatever reason, they sell their labor, their work, for a period of years to someone else, right? And the way it often happened in the American colonies was that someone who was really poor and who didn't have much of any prospect for improvement in, let's say, a big city like London, would say, okay, I can't afford this, but I'd like to go to a colony and see if I could do better there. I can't afford the cost of the shipping across the ocean. I can't pay my own way. So in return for someone else, like a ship captain or a merchant paying that cost, they would sign a contract saying that I will work for X number of years, for let's say 5 years, to pay off that debt. And so the ship captain pays their way, and then when they get to America, the ship captain says, well, I don't want this person to work for me. I'm going to sell this contract to, you know, someone who needs the labor. And so a tobacco planter in Virginia says, fine, I'll buy that contract, and then you work for 5 years, right? So slavery wasn't the only way to do it. What slavery was upfront the most expensive way, right? It's like, you know, this is an awful thing to do, to compare a person to a thing, but it's like, if you can buy a car or you can lease a car, right? And if you had to buy a car up front with cash and you had to have $30,000 or whatever it was right in your pocket, it might be really difficult to make that happen at all. But if you can, you know, have a lease where you only have to pay $300 a month, well, okay, I can do that. And so it's the same sort of deal. The question is, do you want to, and do you have the resources to buy a human being's labor for life, or do you just want to rent someone for a few years? And the decision factor then has two parts to it. One is, how long do I think this person is going to live, right? Because if you have to pay, you know, no one would buy cars if they only lasted 4 years, right? You would only lease it, right?
That's fascinating. That is the exact same calculation that one makes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you think a person is going to live 40 years, and you're going to have all of their labor for that life, and if that person might reproduce and you'll have their children and their children forever, then that makes more sense. But the second part of the factor is, what is this labor that they're going to do be getting me, right? And in the Sugar Islands, like Barbados and later Jamaica and Antigua, the like, the answer was a lot, right? That if I have enough of these people that I can just work to death, they're going to produce sugar that is going to make me filthy rich. And that is what happened, right? That in places like Barbados and Jamaica, some of these planters became so rich that they moved back to England, became members of parliament, had great estates, you know, and some of the great fortunes of England today are ones that were originally built on the sugar trade. In Massachusetts, no matter how much labor you had, you were still raising cows and pigs and sheep and corn and barley and wheat. And that was fine, but it was not going to make you great fortunes. So my own sense is that a lot of the decision in Massachusetts to do other forms of labor in Massachusetts were based on that same kind of calculation. It's not because they were better people. It's not because they were Puritans. Those Puritan lords in Providence Island in the 1630s were totally going the direction of slavery, right? That was not, they had the wealth to do it. They were in a place where they thought they'd be able to do the same kind of exotic, valuable commodity. So it was not because they were Puritans. I think it had everything to do with a calculation that, you know, we don't have the resources to, I mean, we don't have the kind of productivity that would make it worthwhile. And that suggestion that Emmanuel Downing made that, well, if we could go to war with the Indians here, get captives, and trade them for enslaved Africans, that's kind of a commitment to perpetual war, right? That's like saying, you know, from here on in, we are going to be at war with Indians and be taking them as slaves whenever we can. And I do think that violated a moral sense of what the Massachusetts Bay Company was about, because there was a very strong ultimately unsuccessful and really tragic, but a very strong commitment to the idea that Indians could be part of the Massachusetts community, that they could become Christians just like the English were, right? And I don't think the leadership of Massachusetts was prepared to just say, yep, from here on in, it's just the war of all against all.
That's really a great point, and it really ties well also to, something we talked about last week with Christine DeLucia about how King Philip's War in a lot of ways sort of marked the end of these sort of, which you mentioned too, this sort of intention or to include the native population in some way as Christians, obviously. But I want to, so I think we have time for one more question that I really want to get to. But before I do, I want to make sure that I cover any questions from the students. Is there any questions that people have before I ask Professor Peterson to say just a couple words about about one thing? All right. So my last question, and it's totally unfair because it's really a huge question. I'm going to ask you to answer it in a couple of minutes, but I would be remiss not to get to what's on this mug, which is actually the topic of the second and third chapters, which I didn't assign, but some very ambitious students may have read. But, students may not know that, and why would you, that Massachusetts minted its own coins, right? And on this mug, right, we have two kinds of shillings that Massachusetts minted that was famous for, the pine tree shilling and the oak tree shilling. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe you'd just say a word about a point you mentioned before about how the money sort of dried up. When people stopped coming, but why it became important for Massachusetts to mint its own money, which really is my way of explaining my mug.
So this is a subject that I think is really hard for modern Americans to wrap their heads around, in part because the United States has had such a stable monetary system for so long, right? That none of us live in a world where we've experienced anything like a huge inflationary or deflationary crisis, or a shortage of an overall money supply. Actually, one of the really funny things, not funny, odd things about the COVID crisis is the way it created this shortage of change in the US, because people simply were not going to stores, and when they did, they were not using coins and dollar bills. They were increasingly using electronic forms of money, and therefore their change was literally sitting at home in dresser drawers and kitchen counters and whatever, and businesses of the sort that need them, like laundromats or whatever, were not, they couldn't get it, right? But that sort of COVID laundromat condition is something that whole societies could experience for long periods of time. And colonial societies were unusually susceptible to it for all of the reasons that I've been talking about. That is, they tend to be places that are highly dependent on their overseas suppliers. They can't make a lot of things that they need, and so they have to buy them. And merchants want to be paid in good money. That is money that they know is reliable and valuable. And in the era that we're talking about, that mainly meant silver and gold, and mostly silver, minted by kings, by governments, like the pounds, shillings, and pence of England, or the pieces of 8, the pesos of the Spanish world. And in Europe at this time, the Spanish money was far and away the most dominant one. And in those days, you didn't worry about political boundaries. If you went from France to Spain, you didn't have to change your money, because the value in money was in part understood to be its intrinsic value as silver. That as long as your coin was a good coin that weighed as much as a peso or a shilling was supposed to, it was fine wherever you went. the problem in New England was that they just didn't have any of those, because any silver that they had, they used to buy the clothing and the tools and et cetera that they needed. And so what that meant was that within New England itself, to the extent that internal trade happened, it tended to happen without those things, without silver and gold. So, you know, a farmer might sell a merchant, 100 pounds worth of corn, but he wouldn't actually get coins in return for it, or at least initially he might not. Instead, he would get the tools and the clothes and etc. They would keep track in monetary units. It wasn't just barter. It wasn't like, you give me 2 coffee mugs and I'll give you a beaver hat. It was, these 2 coffee mugs cost, 6 shillings. And then I say, okay, well, this hat is worth 6 shillings. And so we've made a monetary exchange.
Credit
but
system.
there was no money, right? But here was the problem, right? So I've already described this first crisis where Massachusetts farmers are producing more than they need themselves because they know migrants with money are coming in, so they're going to be able to sell it. And then with that money, they can buy what they want. But then they had this crisis where the migration stopped, the money stopped coming in, and the farmers had produced way too much, and its price was now nothing. They couldn't give the stuff away. And so they're going to enter this new economy. That is, the merchants are now saying, oh, it's going to be great. Produce more stuff than you can use, and I'll buy it because it's all going to go to Barbados. And the farmer's response is, well, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that, because if I produce tons of corn and so does my neighbor and so does my neighbor down the road, how do I know we're not going to be just stuck with this again? The best solution to that kind of problem is money, right? That is, if you know that the things you produce are going to be compensated with money, then that's going to be good money that you can use to buy anything else you need, well, then that's fine, right? Like, if I didn't know that my book was going to be sold on a market for money, there is no great reason why I should produce not just the book, but 7,000 copies of it, right? Because then I would just have a giant stack of paper in my house. Money does that work.
And you can keep it. Then you can keep it and make purchases. It's not, you don't need to get something in return immediately.
Exactly. Like, if I were paid in sheep, well, a sheep might be valuable, but A, I have to feed that sheep, so it actually costs money. The sheep might die, right? And I don't know if anyone else is going to want a sheep anytime soon.
And
so,
sorry.
Yeah, no, so I know we're running out of time, so I'll be real quick about this. So what Massachusetts thought was, well, we need some kind of money supply, right, in order to make the economy move. And they tried various things. And one of the things that they tried was wampum, which looks like this, right? Beads made out of shells that the Indians of New England had been using long before the colonists came. But wampum wasn't money for Indians. It was this sort of ceremonial and like kind of memory good, that you could weave these belts out of them so that when one tribe or nation made an agreement with another, you would exchange these belts, and the belts themselves would be like a written record that, yes, I have agreed that for the next 5 years, you can use my land to hunt on, or something like that, right? It wasn't really money. It was only chiefs or important people who used this stuff. But when Europeans saw these Indian exchanges, they mistook them for money. And the Europeans then started using it as a kind of currency themselves. And so for a while, because these were beads made from shells that you found in clams along the Long Island Sound, it was like, oh, not only is it like money, but we can make it. We can have more of it. And they used it for a while, but it ultimately failed because they made too much of it. And because the principal thing that you acquired with it, furs, started to be overhunted and disappeared. So before a decade or so was out, New England was awash in wampum and nothing that you could buy it with. And so it collapsed as a money supply. And so it was at that point, and at the point when Spanish silver is starting to come to New England through the Caribbean trade, that Massachusetts gets the idea of, well, we can solve this problem if we coin our own money out of these Spanish coins. This was crazy. Don't try this at home, right? Don't go out and make your own dollars and quarters and nickels,
I don't
because
know.
it's a capital crime. You'll spend the rest of your life in jail. The feds, the FBI will come and get you.
But
And
you
the
want to
same-
know. But
the
you
same
want to know
was
what?
true in the 17th century.
But
right?
you want to know what? I actually looked it up. You can there are some collectors who are selling them. You can buy them for anywhere from $6,000 to $7,000.
Oh yeah,
You can
oh
get
yeah. They're now very valuable
a
collectors.
shilling, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Peterson. It's been absolutely perfect. I loved it. And so now, before you all drop off, I have to give you the question to win these oak tree and pine tree shillings. Okay, so get your pens ready. All right, which of the following Boston landmarks would have been underwater at the time of Boston's founding in 1630? A, the Public Garden. B, Logan Airport. C, Quincy Market. D, the Prudential Center. Or E, North Station. All right, so it can be more than one. Tell me which of them would have been underwater in 1630 and email me your answers. And with that, I have to let you all go. But thank you so much, Mark. It's really been wonderful. We've learned an enormous amount.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And everybody should buy a copy of
Makes
Professor
an
Peterson's
excellent
book.
Christmas gift. Holidays, birthdays, anything.
Thanksgiving.
You want.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah, Thanksgiving.
Actually, in all seriousness, I wouldn't recommend everybody's book to buy for a relative who want to explore the history of Boston or anywhere else, or I wouldn't recommend all of my colleagues' books as presents for family members. But this is one I would, if your parents are interested in the history of Boston. I think they'll really enjoy it. Cousins, aunts. Professor Vinrich, what was A of your question? A was Public Garden.
Could you possibly post this?
Yes, I'll post it as an announcement on Canvas. Everybody wants it. It's a good one. It's two-tone. You got to get it. And congratulations, Emma. I'll email me about, I'm actually going to be at Renaissance Park later if you want to come pick up your mug. This beautiful one, I will have it for you. All right. Take care, everybody.
Okay,
Thanks again,
thank you.
Mark. I really
Bye-bye.
enjoyed it. Bye.